We've been talking a lot as we've been studying through 2 Corinthians about the proper credentials of a spiritual leader, right? Fathers are a spiritual leader, right? Pastors are a spiritual leader. Elders are spiritual leaders. Sunday school teachers are spiritual leaders. In your home, moms, dads, spiritual leaders. So as we kind of look at these qualifications, we might say, well, they're just for one certain segment of people. They're just for you, Aaron. They're just for people in a position like yours. And that is true. This is a lot on me, a lot on elders, a lot on people who have official roles in the church. But all of us are spiritual leaders in one sense or another. So we should be able to see these same kind of characteristics in our own life. We should be imitating not the false teachers, these super apostles, and their self-aggrandizement, their self-advertisement, their ego, their arrogance, their pride, their false messages. We shouldn't be imitating that in our lives. Instead, we should be imitating the humility and the sacrifice and the love of Paul. Just like Paul says, I'm not going to boast in the things that really would make me great by human standards. Instead, I'm going to boast in my weaknesses because it's then that Christ is strong. So it reminds me of this scene from Monty Python here in The Search for the Holy Grail. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of this movie, by the way. I just don't get British humor. But there's a couple of scenes in here that are good, and sometimes I'll, when on YouTube, I'll say, hey, you got to watch this scene from this movie. And so this is one sometimes I make the kids watch because I think it's pretty funny. But the idea is you've got this troll who lives down at this bridge, and King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, they're searching for the Holy Grail, and in order to find the Holy Grail, they've got to cross this bridge. But the troll is there to make sure that the people who cross the bridge are the right types of people, the people that have the proper credentials. And so he has some questions that he needs to ask people to make sure that they are the right people to cross the bridge. So you got this party of four. We've got 3 Knights of the Round Table, and we've got King Arthur, and they come down to this troll of this bridge that they want to cross. And so the troll says to them, oh, you want to cross the bridge of death? Then you need to answer me these questions 3 if the other side you want to see. So Sir Robin looks pretty distressed because he's kind of always been the scaredy cat throughout the entirety of the movie. And so he's kind of like, I'm not going to go first. But Sir Lancelot, he's this tough guy. And so he walks down and he says, give me the questions. I can pass any test. And so the troll says, well, what's your name? And he says, well, I'm Sir Lancelot of Camelot. Oh, well, what is your quest? He's like, well, I'm seeking the Holy Grail. And he says, what's your favorite color? And he says, blue. And the troll says, cool. Go on over. So Sir Robin's like, well, that's easy. I just got to know my name, my quest, and my favorite color. I can do that. So Sir Robin jumps down and says, do me next. Am I worthy to cross the bridge? And so the troll asks him, what's your name? Well, I'm Sir Robin of Camelot. What's your quest? I seek the Grail. All right. What is the capital of Assyria? And then Robin's like, well, I don't know that. And all of a sudden he just flies away. So I guess if you're determined to be unworthy, not only can you not cross the bridge, but I guess you just fly away into outer space. I don't know where they go. Doesn't seem to be a pleasant place, I'm sure. So that doesn't stop Sir Galahad, though. Sir Galahad goes right down. He's not daunted by the fact that his friend just flew off the planet. And so he gets down there and says, ask me the questions. See if I'm worthy to cross the bridge. What's your name? Well, I'm Sir Galahad of Camelot. What's your quest? Well, I seek the Grail. And then he says, what's your favorite color? And he goes, blue. Wait, no, yellow. Guess he doesn't even know his own opinion. So King Arthur has just watched 2 of his people just fly up into space, but he doesn't mind, I guess. So he walks on down to the troll and says, ask me the questions. And so the troll says, who are you? Well, I'm Arthur, King of the Britons. Okay, what's your quest? Well, I'm seeking the Holy Grail. And then he says, well, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? And for a second there, King Arthur looks a little bit confused, but then he says, an African swallow or a European swallow? And then the troll says, well, I don't know that. The troll flies away, and then King Arthur's just allowed to go across. So the whole thing is, do you have the right qualifications to cross this bridge? Do you have what it takes? Are you the right kind of person? And that's exactly what Paul is trying to say. He's looking at these false apostles, and he's looking at their lives, and he's saying, they don't have the qualifications to be a spiritual leader. They don't have the character. They don't have the competence. They don't have the service mindset. Instead, they're in it for themselves. They're in it for self-aggrandizement and self-advertisement. They're in it to build up their own kingdom, and they're going to do it at your expense. They're going to exploit you. They don't pass the test. They are not good spiritual leaders. We, on the other hand, talking about Titus and the Macedonian guy and Timothy and Paul, we're of a different sort. We are people who are trying our best to live out what God has called us to be as spiritual leaders. And so Paul wants to ingrain in the mind of the Corinthians what it takes to be a spiritual leader. And this isn't just something that he says here at the end of the book. He's been saying this over and over and over again throughout the entirety of these 13 chapters. He's been talking about what makes somebody a good, solid spiritual leader and what makes somebody, someone that's in it for themselves. What are characteristics and competencies that make somebody worth listening to and worth following? That's what Paul wants to put on here for the Corinthians to see. And spoiler alert, let's just do the spoilers right now. It's not rank, it's not position, it's not pedigree. These are not the things that make you a good spiritual leader. They're the things we tend to look at. Like, we're going to go on a pastoral search here in a little bit, and what are we going to be looking for? What kind of degree do they have? We're going to look at, what kind of experience that they have. I'm not saying that we shouldn't look at those things, they're important. But are those the entirety of what it means to be a good spiritual leader? Absolutely not. Can you have all those things and be an awful human being and just be in it for your own ego? You better believe you can. And so there has to be something more to it than just rank and pedigree, position, or education, or how many letters of recommendation that you have. It's about your character. It's about your competence. It's about your service mindset. And I think that's what Paul's going to say. In the accounting world, it's kind of strange because public accounting especially, you've got this really rigid system of rank. And you're supposed to be able to tell a lot about somebody based on what their rank is. So you start out as this lowly little baby staff accountant for a couple of years. And then if you do well at that, then they might move you up to be senior accountant. And that means that you're going to oversee the staff. And then once you're a senior accountant for a couple of years, they might move you up to be in charge. And so you'll be in charge of an audit, or you'll be in charge of a huge tax client. And if you do good there, then you might move up and you become manager. And then all of a sudden you're over multiple engagements. And if you do good as a manager, that's where they really eat you alive, then you might be able to become partner. And even once you buy in as partner, there's going to be a partner, then there's going to be managing partner, and there's going to be senior partner, all sorts of different kinds of partners even. And you're supposed to be able to tell a lot about somebody just by knowing their title, just by knowing their rank. Somebody tells me that they're a senior accountant, I can assume some of the things that they're doing every day. I can assume some of the things that they're in charge of. But does that necessarily mean that every senior accountant is more talented and more knowledgeable than the staff? Absolutely not. Does it mean that every partner is more knowledgeable than a manager and can do a better job at things? Absolutely not. There are awful partners and there are brilliant staff. So as much as a title can tell you, it cannot tell you everything. It really can't even tell you the most important things. The things that are soft, the things that make somebody that's good to work with, make somebody that's good to follow. And it's the same thing in the church world. Somebody could have 15 years of experience as a pastor. Somebody could have a doctorate of ministry. And that doesn't mean that they necessarily are a great spiritual leader by God's definition of success. And so we need to make sure that when we're appointing spiritual leaders, electing spiritual leaders, or just following spiritual leaders, that they're people that are worthy to be followed, that there are people in it that have character, that they are competent in what they're doing, and that they are service-minded. They want to build the church up. They don't want to tear the church down. And that's exactly what Paul is going to say here. Say you and I have a disagreement over theology, and for most of us it's happened, right? And you're arguing with me about the Bible, and I say to you, it doesn't really matter what you say, because I've got 7 years of higher education, and I have an MDiv, and I know the original languages, and blah, blah, blah. Is that persuasive to you? Of course it's not. That'd be the dumbest thing that anybody could do. But I've seen it happen. I've seen pastors do it. I've seen professors do it. I've seen them say, well, my opinion matters more than your opinion because I've got some sort of fancy pedigree, or I've got some sort of fancy rank, or I have a better education than you do, or whatever it might be. Just make a good argument, right? That's how you're going to win the argument. You're not going to win the argument by pulling rank. You're going to win the argument by saying, yeah, this is what I think the Bible says. Here's where it says it, and this is why I believe it. And that's exactly how a lot of these authoritarian leaders do it. They just say, well, my position is more important than yours. I know more than you, and you got to listen to me. And I think that's what these false teachers were like. They were very authoritarian, and the way that they approached the church at Corinth. And Paul says that's not what makes somebody a good spiritual leader. That's not somebody who's service-minded. That's not somebody who has character. That's somebody who is in it for themselves. So the lifestyle of our leaders should show that they care about the Word of God, they care about interpreting it correctly, that they're humble, and that they love those around them, even people with whom they may disagree. One of the most valuable things I learned in seminary was the idea of chips. So I never really knew, are we talking poker chips? Are we talking potato chips? I never really knew what people were talking about, but here, let me explain the idea. Because it's not just true with being a spiritual leader, it's also true with being a parent, a father, a mother. And this is the idea that you can build chips in any relationship, and those chips give you influence in someone else's life. Okay, so let's talk about it from a pastor's perspective for a second. So I preach a good sermon. I get 3 chips in your heart. I preach a bad sermon, I might lose 10 chips. Okay? I show up and visit you when you're in the hospital, I might gain 100 chips. I show up, or I miss the fact that you're in the hospital, I didn't even know I don't show up, I might lose 1,000 chips. I'm there and I preach a funeral of your loved one, I might gain 10,000 chips. I know a pastor that accidentally slept in and missed a funeral that he was supposed to preach. I'm sure he lost a bunch of chips. You get the idea. It's a kind of a crass way to look at relationships, but it's definitely true. You can see that in any relationship of your life. The more you're involved in somebody's life, the more influence you earn. If I'm not involved in your life at all, and then I stand up here and try to tell you how to live, why listen to me? Okay, I'm just some guy up here blowing hot air. But if you know that I care about you and you know that I'm there for you, you're going to be more apt to listen to the things that I have to say. And it's the same thing in the parenting world, right? You earn chips in the life of your child. You show up at a baseball game, show up at a show choir invitational. You earn chips. You miss those, you lose chips. You mock your kid or you push them into the ground. You lose chips. You build them up and encourage them, you gain that. And so it's the same thing. The more we care, the more we build up a relationship with somebody, the more that they know that we're there to serve them, the more influence we're going to gain in their life. It's just how it works. And Paul's trying to say the same thing to the Corinthians. These false teachers do not have your best intentions at heart. They don't care about you. They don't care about your success. All they care about is themselves. We have been there for you, day in and day out, sending you things and helping to minister to you, helping to plant the church, helping to show you the truth of the true gospel message. We've been there not for ourselves or to exploit you, but we've been there for you. And so Paul's trying to point this out, saying, this is how you can tell who the real spiritual leader is. Because that's what we have. We have a dichotomy now. Is Paul telling us the truth, and should we follow his ministry? Or are these false teachers telling us the truth, and we should follow their ministry? Because they're taking us in very different directions. So Paul's got this position where he's got to defend himself, he's got to defend his partners, and this is how he's doing it. He's doing it by training them. This is how you look for a godly spiritual leader. This is how you look for somebody who actually cares about you rather than caring about themselves. Because let me tell you something. There are spiritual leaders, even spiritual leaders with credentials, that don't care about people. And that's what ministry is when you boil it down. Ministry is caring about people. It's building good relationships of caring so that we can influence people to draw closer to God. And there are a lot of spiritual leaders out there that's not what they care about at all. Mark Twain used to call these people those that went about doing missionarying. Missionarying. I don't know if I can pronounce that word. He coined the word. And it wasn't a good word for him. It wasn't like, oh, I love these people that go about missionarying. Because what would happen back then is that, preachers would go from town to town. And they would take a tent, almost like a circus. And they would set up their tent, and they would invite in the town, and they would come in, and they'd do a couple of magic tricks. Usually they would have people that would pretend to be sick, and then they would heal them. Then they'd pass around the plate. People would give money. They'd pull the tent down, and they'd go to the next city. And so this was missionarying in Mark Twain's opinion. And they were performing this for the audience. They were performing this for their own ego. They wanted to swindle people out of their money. And this is not what a spiritual leader should look like. This is what the false teachers at Corinth look like. This is not what Paul and his team look like. Paul and his team were characterized by character and competence and service. They cared about other people more than themselves. And so Paul wanted the Corinthians to be able to spot this. He wanted them to be able to look at these false leaders and see that their character failed. And it's not just about rank. It's not just about pedigree. It's not just about title. It's about who they are on the inside. It's about, do they live what they say? All right, so let's take a look at three things here that Paul says should be true of a spiritual leader. And I think the big idea, the central truth here, which maybe will come up. All right, there you go. Godly spiritual leaders don't exploit. Instead, they build. They don't exploit people for their own gain. Instead, they build other people up for their gain. That's a huge difference between the two. So we're going to look at three different credentials here. One of them is true just of apostles. So I just want to make that clear first. And the second two, I think, are true of any kind of spiritual leader, even all the way down to being parents and grandparents. All right, so what are these three credentials that we should see in the life of a spiritual leader? So the first one Paul talks about is that there should be outward signs of God's work. And he's literally talking here about being a capital A apostle. Okay, so like Peter and James and John, Paul taught that he himself was an apostle, and we'll see why here as we go through this. But let's look at verses 11 and 12a here. I have become a fool. You yourselves forced me to do it. For I should have been commended by you. For I lack nothing in comparison to these super apostles, even though I am truly nothing. Indeed, the signs of an apostle were performed among you with great perseverance, by signs and wonders and powerful deeds. Because we see the signs of God's work here, the miraculous signs that accompany being an apostle. All right, so let's say you're driving down 33 tonight. It's just past dark, and you're driving into Fort Wayne for something, or coming out of Fort Wayne for something. And you look up in your rearview mirror, and there's this car that's really close behind you. All right? And you look down at your speedometer, and you're like, oh my goodness, I'm going like 8 or 9 miles an hour over the speed limit. Okay? And then all of a sudden, you see that on the top of this car, a little red light begins to flash. Oh, I'm getting pulled over. All right, so you pull over. But as you're looking in your rearview mirror, you're thinking about this car, and you're like, I don't remember any kind of Allen County cop or any kind of state trooper or any kind of Fort Wayne cop that has a purple cop car. That looks a little strange. So you're beginning to scratch your head, right? And then you said the light. Why is it just one red light that's stuck on top of the car? Usually they have like a bar of lights, or there's lights in the windshield if it's like an unmarked car. Why just one light? I mean, anybody could go buy that from Walmart and put it on their car. And so you've got some concerns here. Then the guy gets out of his car and starts to walk towards your car. And you look at him, and he's got some sort of uniform on, but it doesn't look like any kind of uniform that you're used to or that you've ever seen before in your life. And he comes over and he knocks on your window. What do you do? Right? This is probably what I would do. I'd probably roll down my window a little bit, and I'd probably ask for a little bit more. Can you show me your credentials? And the one thing that you could probably ask a cop to see is probably their badge. So maybe I would ask for their badge. Can you show me your badge? And so they give me their badge, and they slip it through the little hole in my window, and I look at it, and it says, best cowboy in the West, and it's got like some, Colorado amusement park at the bottom of it. I'm going to slip it back through and say, I don't think so, buddy. You don't have the right credentials. I'm not stopping for you. I'm not rolling down my window for you. Okay, the cop car, not a good credential. The lights, not a good credential. The uniform, not a good credential. The badge, not a good credential. Forget you. I'm not gonna listen to you. Okay, and so this is the same thing. Paul's saying, with the office of apostle comes certain credentials and certain verifying things that we can look at. And he says, I have those things. These people who are claiming to be apostles, these super apostles, which I think is Paul's sarcastic name for them, these super apostles, they don't have these qualifications. If you look at them, you looked at them closely, you would say these people do not fit the bill. So what are the kind of credentials that Paul is saying that he has that they don't have here? And I think there's three. One, that apostle has to be somebody who witnessed the resurrected Jesus. Second, an apostle has to be somebody who was called by Jesus to this specific ministry of apostleship. And third, it has to be somebody that's ministry is accompanied by signs and wonders. All right? And if we look at Paul's life, we see these three things. And if we look at the lives of these false apostles, we don't see any of these things at all. So Paul's trying to tell them that he is the real deal, he's the genuine artifact, and that these false apostles are counterfeits, and that they shouldn't be listened to. Now, that doesn't mean that he's better than everybody else. I like how he kind of throws that in there at the end of that verse. I think it's verse 12 or 11. He says, but I am nothing. He's trying to He's trying to brag about his apostleship to make sure that people know that he's an apostle, but at the same time, he still wants to appear as humble as possible. So he's saying, just because I have the office of apostle does not mean I'm a better human being than you. It doesn't even mean I'm more spiritual than you. I just have a different office than you do. Right? So he wants to make sure that that's clear. He's not trying to say, well, I'm so great, I'm an apostle, and you guys are lowly, and you guys just got to listen to me. That's not what he's doing at all. He's trying to defend himself so that he can defend the message that he is preaching against the error of these false teachers. So, what makes somebody an apostle? Where did I get those three things? Well, if we go back to the beginning of the book of Acts, remember they lost an apostle. They lost Judas. And so the early church decided that they still wanted to have 12 to kind of maintain that symbolism. And so they were like, well, how do we pick somebody? So eventually they decide on electing somebody to be part of the 12. But they had two criteria that they were using. The first criteria is that they have to have been somebody who witnessed the ministry and the resurrected Jesus. And they have to be somebody that was commissioned by God or commissioned by Jesus. So they scour everybody in the early church looking for people who fit this bill. And they find how many? 2. There's only 2 people that fit the bill. And at that point, they're like, well, which one of these 2 good options do we choose? And so then they just rolled dice. They cast lots. Casting lots is. So they just cast lots and said, well, let God decide with chance, who the right one is. That's how they pick somebody. So they had those 2 qualifications. Only 2 people met it. All right, so then we get to Paul. And Paul, did he meet those 2 qualifications? Well, first of all, we would say, well, Paul didn't really see the resurrected Christ in the same way that the disciples, the other apostles did, because he wasn't around them. But we do know that the resurrected Jesus did appear to him on the road to Damascus. And what did the resurrected Christ do when he appeared to Paul on the road to Damascus? He gave him a commission to be the apostle to the Gentiles. So he was commissioned to be an apostle by Jesus himself. He also witnessed the resurrected Lord. So he meets those 2 qualifications. And we also learn from Paul here that, accompanying the life of an apostle should also be, miraculous things that they can do. And Paul definitely was able to do miraculous things. In Cyprus, so we start going on his missionary journeys. In Cyprus, he blinded a sorcerer. In Iconium, he did signs and wonders. In Philippi, he performed an exorcism. In Ephesus, he healed the sick. In Troas, he raised the dead. It got to the point where he would bless a handkerchief, and somebody could take that handkerchief back to a sick relative and put it on them, and they would be healed. And so, yes, there are all sorts of miraculous signs that accompanied the life of Paul. So here's where we may need to make an important distinction. There are in the New Testament capital A apostles and there are lowercase a apostles. Okay, so when I say lowercase a apostle, like if you read the gift list in Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul lays out the spiritual gifts that are given to individual members of the church. One of those is the gift of apostleship. And what does that mean? Well, it means that somebody has the spiritual gift of church planting, of going into a new area and starting a new work, or going into an area where there's a dying work and revitalizing that work. And it takes a certain kind of person to do that. It takes a certain kind of personality. It takes a certain set of talents. It takes a certain set of spiritual gifts. And so there are small a apostles, but Paul is not claiming to be a small a apostle here, even though, of course, he is one. He is claiming to be a capital A apostle, just like the 12, just like Peter, just like James, just like John. Paul is in the office, the official office of apostle. And how can we know that? We can know that by the signs that he is able to perform. These signs give credibility to Paul's work. They give credibility to the truth of the gospel message. The gospel, that grace and forgiveness come through the work of Jesus and Jesus alone. So Paul wanted his audience not to see the miracles, though. He wanted them to see through the miracles, to see the power of God. Paul knew that the Holy Spirit was not some sort of tool in his hands that he could wield at will and do whatever he wanted with it. He knew that he was a tool in the hands of the Holy Spirit, performing these miraculous works for the betterment of the church. So yeah, these miracles showed the power of God, but they also demonstrated the love of God. Okay, so these false teachers were into the power of it, even though they couldn't do anything about it. They weren't able to perform any of these kinds of signs. But they also didn't even bother to give lip service to the love that was involved. So if you think about these miracles, why would Paul heal somebody? Because he felt compassion for them. Same with Jesus, right? Why did Jesus heal people? Yeah, it was to show power, but it was also to show love. How many miracles can you think of where love wasn't the motivating factor? that they wanted to see somebody's life become better. I can think of a couple, just like when Jesus cursed the fig tree and it withered. I mean, there's a couple. But if you look at all of them, I'd say about 95% are about helping people, being compassionate towards people. Yes, they were demonstrations of power, but even more than that, they were demonstrations of the compassion of God, and they were a demonstration of his love for people. So it's not that Paul didn't have a pedigree. It's not that Paul didn't have a rank. If we can imagine him as an Eagle Scout, we could just see like his whole chest just covered in buttons and ribbons or as a military officer, just all sorts of stuff all over his chest. He's a highly decorated person. He had the pedigree, he had the track record, he had the lineage, he had the experience, he had the office, he had the track record of success. He had a resume that these false teachers could only dream of. Yet Paul doesn't step into the argument and say, here, let me tell you about all my great things about me, why you should follow me. He says, no, a true, godly spiritual leader is not going to be somebody that is lording it over you and telling you how great they are. It's going to be somebody who serves you, somebody who wants what is best for you, somebody who shows compassion for you. And so Paul's doing this because he knows that if he is discredited, then the true gospel message is discredited as well. If these false teachers succeed, then that's going to lead the Corinthians down a bad path towards false teaching. So that's the first one that we learn, is that there are signs of God's work, especially in the life of an apostle, and Paul had those signs. The second one here is character, good character. So what are some proper credentials for spiritual leaders? Who can cross the bridge? People who have signs of God's work in their heart, which we could look at as compassion for people. They also, somebody that has good character, integrity, people who live out what they say. Spiritual leaders who don't just tell you how to live, but they show you how to live by what they do every day in their life. There are just some people that think they're above the rules. They think they're important enough that they're above the rules. Those are not the kind of leaders that we should follow. We should follow leaders who understand that they too are below the rules, and they too are trying to live out the example of Christ. I like how James says it in James chapter 1. He says, don't merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Simple as that, right? Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in the mirror and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what they have heard but doing it, they will be blessed. So basically what James is saying is, if you truly believe in something, it should affect how you live. And we should expect that from our spiritual leaders, that if they say that they believe something, then it should change how they live. We say so much more by our example than by the words that come out of our mouth. It's like a General Motors executive. So if you were to open up the garage of a General Motors executive, what would you expect to find? Probably GM vehicles. What if you opened it up and there was a Toyota and a Honda? You'd be like, wait a second, buddy. What if you went to the KFC guy to his house and you looked on his dinner table and he's got a whole bunch of Chick-fil-A wrappers? You'd be like, wait a second. If you think Chick-fil-A is so great, why aren't you eating, or if you think KFC is so great, why aren't you eating KFC? We would expect people to live what they say. And this is what Paul's saying. You should expect your leaders to live the values that they espouse, to be examples to the flock. I used to have this boss, and she had this great idea. At least it was great in her mind. She thought, well, this is what you need to do. We need to, the corporate people came down and said, you guys need to get people signed up for credit cards. Okay, you need to get some credit card applications. And they came to us and they said, it doesn't even matter if they get approved. If you just get a credit card application signed, that'll be good enough. So my boss had this great idea. She's like, well, Aaron, why don't you go over to the gas station and just buy a whole bunch of lottery tickets. And then when the customers come up, we will ask them if they will fill out a credit card application. They don't even have to be approved or not. And if they fill out the application, sign it, we'll give them a lottery ticket. So we put up signs all across the branch that that's what we were doing. And every single customer that came in, we were going through this huge spiel of, you can sign up for a credit card. You don't have to be approved. Don't worry about that. Because people who are motivated by a lottery ticket are probably not those that are also going to get approved. I don't know if that's good to say or not. Anyway, so it was just a kind of a numbers game, right? And so there's like 4 of us there working, and every customer that comes to our window, we're talking to them about oh yeah, you need to sign this up and we can get your lottery ticket. And then they would start filling it out right at your window, and it'd probably take them 5 or 6 minutes to fill it out. And so we were getting really backed up. I mean, the line was going all the way out the building. And so somebody with a head teller goes over to the boss and says, can we just stop doing this until it slows down? Oh, no, we got to ask everybody. All right. So she's, don't worry about it. I'll come out and I'll help. Oh, cool. So manager comes out behind teller line, opens up her window, starts waiting on customers. She's standing right next to me. Guess how many times I heard her ask somebody to fill out a credit card application? 0. All right. And in my mind, and in the mind of everybody else I worked with, they were like, wait a second. You're telling us to do this, but you don't do it yourself. It definitely wasn't motivating to be like, yeah, I can't wait to sell these credit card applications. It made me want to just stop right there and then. Because, hey, if you're going to tell me to do it, you better be willing to do it too. It's good that you wanted to come and help us, but hey, if we're going to live by a set of rules, shouldn't you live by the same set of rules? And so Paul's looking at these false teachers, and he's saying they think they're above the rules. They think that they can act their own way. They think that they can exploit people and take advantage of you. They think that they don't have to have character in their lives, all the while telling you that you need to have character in your lives. And these are people that should not be followed. These are people who are not good, solid spiritual leaders. Those who are good, solid spiritual leaders will live what they say. They will take their own advice. They won't just talk the talk, they'll walk the walk, right? We always say that kind of stuff. Here's a passage from 1 Peter 5 where he says the same thing. Peter says this, to the elders among you, so spiritual leaders, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Shepherd God's flock that is under your care. Watch over them, not because you have to, because you want to, as God wants you to be, not pursuing dishonest gain, but being eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but serving as an example to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. What's Peter trying to say? If you're going to be a spiritual leader, care about people and be an example and live what you say. Paul didn't take money from them. And this kind of becomes the sticking point. And it's kind of strange for us to think about why, but we talked about this a few months ago when we were talking about when somebody slaps a free sticker on something, you automatically think, why is it free? Okay, so Paul's done the same thing. He's gone into Corinth and he's accepted no money. Even though he's also taught Corinth that, a worker deserves his wages, don't muzzle the ox while it's treading out the grain. He's told them that spiritual leaders should be paid, but at the same time he says, I will not let you pay me. Now he's explained that. He said, you're a new work, you're a new church. I don't want to be a burden on you. You need to grow first. He says, I'm getting supported by other churches in Macedonia. They're supporting me as a missionary. I'm also working with my hands, making tents, just because I don't want to take it from you. I don't want to take advantage of you. And what's interesting here is that the false teachers were coming in and they were taking money all over the place. And so they thought, well, it must be worthwhile because they want money. Then they have the nerve to turn around and say, Paul's trying to exploit you. And they point to the Jerusalem collection that he's taken up, the money that he's taken up for Jerusalem poor. And he says, he's not really taking money up for the Jerusalem poor. He's going to put it in his back pocket. That's how you're going to fund him. Well, if he really wanted money, he could have asked for money and they would have given him money. Okay, he really wanted to help the Jerusalem poor. And so Paul finds himself, kind of having to defend himself here a little bit. And so I want to look here at verse 12. Indeed, the signs of an apostle were performed among you with great perseverance by signs and wonders and powerful deeds. For how were you treated worse than the other churches, except that I myself was not a burden to you? Oh, please forgive me for this injustice. Okay, so that's sarcasm if you can't hear it. Paul's trying to say, forgive me for the injustice of not charging you. Forgive me the injustice of caring about you and doing this for free. But it seems like the false teachers were saying, hey, you can't trust Paul. Paul's trying to keep this money for himself. And so a true spiritual leader is going to live what they say. It's going to be backed up. Their words are going to be backed up by action. All right, so that leads us to the third. Okay, so what are some proper credentials? Who can pass over the bridge where there's signs of God's work, signs of compassion, good, solid character where people, live out what they say. And lastly, they don't exploit people. They're not in it to exploit people. So look at verse 14. Look, for the third time I'm ready to come to Corinth, and I will not be a burden to you again, because I do not want your possessions, but I want you. For children should not have to save up for their parents, but parents for their children. Now I will most gladly spend and be spent for your lives. If I love you more, am I ready to be loved less? But be that as it may, I have not burdened you. Yet because I was a crafty person, I guess I took you in by deceit. I have not taken advantage of you through anyone I have sent to you, have I? I urged Titus to visit you, and I sent out the brother along with him. Titus did not take advantage of you, did he? Did we not conduct ourselves in the same spirit? Did we not behave in the same way? Have you been thinking all this time that we have been defending ourselves to you? Instead, we are speaking in Christ before God, and everything we do, dear friends, is to build you up. And so this is the last criteria, is that godly spiritual leaders should not be in the exploitation business. They should be in the building up business. And this can be little things, it can be small things, but there are all sorts of ways that spiritual leaders can exploit people for their own gain. So let's start small. Okay, so back when I worked as a teller in LaGrange, there must have been a pastor there in LaGrange County that just gave away buckets full of they were $5 bill tracts. I don't know if I could find the $5. Oh yeah, I did find the $5 bill one. Okay, so I must have told them, hey, this is a good way to evangelize. Go out and give these to people. And it was a tract, and it looked identical to a $5 bill. Okay, so I remember working teller window, and just like every other week, somebody would put it down on my teller window and slide it over. And I would think it's a $5 bill because it looks like a $5 bill all folded up. And so I would open it up, and it was a tract. And usually they wouldn't do it like at the beginning of the transaction. They would do it kind of as they were already turned your back to you, like this. And so we would get tons of them. People would put them on the ground. And so you would look down on the ground, and you would think, oh, there's a $5 bill. And you pick it up, and no, it's a tract. I knew somebody that she was a waitress beforehand, and she said that, yeah, I was a waitress. And then, somebody left that $5 bill on the table and had a Post-it note saying this is the best tip you'll ever receive. And there was no actual tip, there was just the tract. Okay, that's fine if you want to do that, but make sure you put an actual tip there too, right? Because it just leaves a bad taste in people's mouth because it feels like you're being lied to. I thought this was a $5 bill, I opened it up, no, this guy's trying to convince me of something. Wouldn't even have a conversation with me, just slipped this over to me and tried to trick me. And I remember thinking at the time, this is exploitative. It might be in a very small way, but it exploits people. So it shouldn't be how we are trying to share the gospel of Jesus. But I haven't seen it for a lot of years, so maybe we've moved on from that, but it was definitely big for a little bit. All right, that's small. What about big? All right, so we used to support this mission called ABWE. All right, and they were supporting the mission when I came here, and I looked into it, I didn't really have a problem with it, so we continued to support the mission. Turns out we got a letter in 2016 that said that the mission was disbanding, and they told us why. All right, and I remember when I got that letter, I showed it to Mark, and I said, "Can you believe what we're reading here?" Okay, so this is what happened. 1989. So 2016 is when we got the letter. So this all started in 1989. So you're talking 17 years earlier. But there was a missionary doctor by the name of Dr. Ketchum. And Dr. Ketchum had been serving as a missionary doctor in North Africa for almost his entire career, just a lot of years. Well, it turns out that entire time he had been abusing kids, little girls. Okay? And whenever these girls it wasn't until 1989 when some of them began to come forward and say that they had been abused. And once one did it, then a whole bunch of others did it as well. So what did the board of ABWE do at that point? Okay, so there's a decision point right then, right? You find out that one of your missionaries is abusing kids. So the first thing they did was good. They fired him, said, you can't work for us anymore. The second thing they did is they brought in every one of those girls that was accusing him and made them sign statements that the relationship between them and Dr. Ketchum was consensual. So that if he would ever get charged criminally, that they could bring that up and say, see, it was a consensual relationship, even though they were, sometimes 12 or 13 at the time. They also never informed anybody. They didn't inform law enforcement. They didn't inform the place where he went to work next. And he spent another 10 years there abusing people and creating more victims. One person came forward in the early 90s and said that they were going to go public with it and they were going to tell people. And so literally ABWE kidnapped her, took her out of the country for 2 years until she would agree not to say anything. In the early 2000s, she decided that she was going to step forward anyway, so she created a group of past victims of Dr. Ketchum, and tons of people started to join it. There were victims all over the place. So at this point, the story started to get a little bit out of hand. But it wasn't until 2016 that the mission organization finally said, yes, this is what happened, this is what we did, it was wrong, we're sorry, we're disbanding. So we just had no clue that any of this was going on. I just get a letter saying, we've disbanded and here's why. And it's because not only did they have somebody that exploited children, which is awful, but then they spent decades covering it up. This cannot happen in the church. Unfortunately, it happens way too often. And so Paul's saying here, I'm not in it to exploit you. These people, they're exploiting you. They're trying to take your money. They're trying to build up their ego. They're trying to build up their own kingdom. And the irony of it, like I just said a little bit ago, is that they were trying to say that Paul was the one exploiting them, that he was going to pocket the Jerusalem collection. He's not going to put that in his back pocket. And, we know that because he's built so much transparency and accountability into the process. It's not just Paul with his hand out saying, hey, give to the Jerusalem poor. I promise you it'll get there. And then puts it in his back pocket. No, he's got Titus involved. He's got this brother involved. We learned in chapter 8 and 9 that there are even other people involved. And he says that. Do you trust Titus? Oh, yeah, we trust Titus. Do you trust the brother that was appointed by the Macedonians? Oh, yeah, we trust him. Then even if you don't trust me, trust the process. Trust that there's a lot of different eyes on this, and trust that your money will get to where I say that it will go. So they were just trying to denigrate Paul in any way they could. They were trying to say that Paul was the one exploiting them, when in reality, they were the ones that were doing the exploitation. And unfortunately, Paul has to set the record straight here. He has to defend himself in order to defend the gospel. We live in an age of clergy scandal. And I'm not saying that there hasn't been clergy scandal in the past. You bet there has. Okay, we just didn't hear about it as much. But I remember back in the 80s, there was that rash of televangelists, that fell into this sin or that sin, Jim Bakker, Jimmy Swaggart, that kind of crowd. And, we remember, it's those televangelists, they're awful humans. Televangelists are awful. That was the message I got at my church, which could be true, right? I'm sure that there's definitely a lot of awful televangelists. But it was colored as, this is a them problem, not an us problem. Okay, and then in the 90s, we had all the scandals with the Catholic priests. And it was the same thing I was hearing in the churches. That's a them problem. There's something wrong in the culture of the Catholic Church that's not wrong in our culture. It's a them problem, not an us problem. And then over the past 15, 20 years, just evangelical pastor after evangelical pastor has had awful things that they've done. Guys like Bill Hybels or Mark Driscoll, you name it. And so it's not just a them problem. Unfortunately, it's a human problem that we need to guard against. The way we do that is we make sure that our spiritual leaders are people who are not in the exploitation business, but they're in the building up business. Unfortunately, there's way too many people that assume a mantle of leadership and then use it for their own gain. These stats are from 2010, so they're way too old, but I'm going to use them anyway. But this is a Gallup poll, and they asked, how much do you trust, or do you trust this profession? Okay, do you trust this profession? And I bet you the numbers are even lower now than this. But do you trust a car salesman? What percentage of people do you think said, oh yeah, I trust a car salesman? Really, it's way too high. It's 15%. 15% of human beings trust a car salesman. Do you trust a lawyer? Okay, we all know lawyers are often seen as kind of disingenuous. But 25%, a quarter of people trust lawyers. All right, so teachers. How many people trust their public school teachers? 86% of people trust the teachers. How many of you trust firefighters? 94% of people trust firefighters. Okay, so where's clergy in there? Okay, so how many of you trust a Catholic priest? 45% of people trusted a Catholic priest. It's less than half. Do you trust a Protestant pastor? Slightly higher. 66% of people trusted a Protestant pastor. So, you might think a spiritual leader should be one of the most trusted people in culture, but they're not. Why? Because there's been so many spiritual leaders that have exploited people. And it just shouldn't happen. Unfortunately, we see it happen in Corinth, and unfortunately, we see it happen in our world today. We teach by our words, but more importantly, we teach by our lives and by living up to the ideals that we espouse. And people are watching. You know, there's an anti-smoking ad which showed a dad telling his kid not to smoke. Don't smoke. All right? And then it shows in the next frame the kid standing behind a tree smoking. Okay, and so what happens? I mean, the kid was told not to smoke. Why is he smoking? And then they go back in time and they watch as this kid follows his dad in his footsteps, like literally puts on his shoes and walks around with these big shoes on. And you see the kid playing basketball with his dad, and you see the kid pretending to drive like his dad, and mowing the lawn behind him, and leaning against the tree just like his dad. And then you see his dad pick up a cigarette, and in the very next frame you see the kid pick up the cigarette. So the message of the commercial is very simple. You're going to say a lot more by what you do than by what you say. Should you say the right things? Yeah. Then should your actions match what you say? Yeah. And when they don't, you should apologize and say, hey, I don't live up to this standard either. I'm sorry. I'm going to try better. That's what good spiritual leaders do. That's what good parents do. So what is Paul saying? He's saying we should expect certain things out of our spiritual leaders. We should expect them to be compassionate and to care about people. We should expect them to have good character, that they do what they say. And we should expect them not to be in the exploitation business, but in the business of building people up. Let's pray. Dear Lord, on this Father's Day, Lord, I just looking up at this list, and I pray that I have compassion for my kids, that I support them and build them up. And Lord, I pray that I don't try to exploit them for any reason, Lord, but just be there to support them and help them to grow. I pray the same thing as a spiritual leader. I pray that I don't just say things, but the things that I say that I do, try to live out as best as I can, Lord. And we know that we can only do that through the power of your Spirit in our lives. And we do know that people are going to make mistakes, Lord, but there's also a right way to handle mistakes. And so that tells us a lot about somebody as well. So we just pray that we can do what we say, that we can live what we teach, that we can look in the mirror and we can see where there's deficiencies and we can correct them, Lord, and that we can build rather than destroy. We pray all this in your wonderful name. Amen. All right, turn with me